Okay, good morning once again. All right, today we are continuing our series of stories, truths, and perceptions. And this morning I'm filling in for Miss Cici Titoles, and she's actually speaking today. She's to my right. And to my left we have Mr. Irvin Williams, both longtime members of NBMC. They're going to be sharing with you today. Before we begin, I'd just like us to bow our heads in a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for allowing us to share our perspectives with everyone, to share our places in life, to share our stories, for the opportunity to relate to one another, to see through each other's eyes, and to understand one another. In your holy name we pray. Amen. Okay, so, to my right, Cici, how are you this morning?
I'm fine, thanks.
Excellent. I'm going to ask you a few questions. Are you ready? Okay. So, where are you and your family from?
Thank you, Brendan. Good morning, everyone. So although I was born in the U.S., which in Muncie, Indiana, actually, which many people are unaware of, I am from Zimbabwe, and I've never actually said I'm American. If the question is asked where you're from Zimbabwe. My parents, Sai and Kumbi, who many of you know, they came here to the States for graduate school. My dad got his PhD here, my mom got her master's here, my dad also got his master's here. So that's the reason my brother and I were born here. But the intention was always for them to go back home after they got their education, so that's what we did. So we returned to Zimbabwe when I was 5, my brother was 7. I was raised in Zimbabwe, of course, immersed in the culture, and actually lived there until age 19 when I moved to Canada for grad school. So, I was just thinking about it. I think it was last year. I sat and I said, I'm first generation American, which is foreign to me. I never considered that I was first generation American because I have always just said I'm from Zimbabwe. And of course, our kids were born here in the States. I guess we're second generation. But again, we are raising them to know where they're from. So when someone says, well, where are you from? They don't say, oh, I'm American. They also say, we're from Zimbabwe. It is important for us that they have a grounding and they know their culture and they know where they're from.
Which part of Canada?
I graduated from McGill in Montreal.
So talk to us a bit about your faith journey.
Okay, so I was raised in a Christian household. My grandfathers on both sides of my family were ministers. As my mom said last week, for those of you who are here, she preached in church and she is a lay preacher in the Methodist church. My father was a choir director in churches for many, many years. When my parents came here for school, they actually went to different churches and they sang together. People may not know that they sing, but they sang duets together in churches. So growing up, going to church was never an option. It was, we're going to go to church. It's never a choice. I'm not complaining though. I'm grateful for that spiritual grounding that I had. I attended Christian schools. I was always actively involved in the Bible club in elementary school and actively involved in my youth church in high school. I do remember actually making the decision to accept Christ as my personal savior when I was 14. And my first priority when I left home and moved to Canada was to find a church. And then when I moved to Boston after that, found a church. People know my husband, Chang Tai. He's also a Christian. His grandfather was also a minister. So our priority when we moved here to Bethesda was to find a church. And we have been part of this church now, so for about 13 years. And when my parents came to join us in the States, we brought them to this church. So my faith has always been something very central in my life. and keeps me grounded and anchored.
Amen. You mentioned singing and other extracurriculars. What other interests and hobbies do you have that people might not know about?
Singing is a big one, and I was part of my school choir in elementary school, part of my choir in high school. Um, Aside from that, I'm very introverted, so I do like just being alone in quiet spaces. I love nature. I love mountains. I enjoy running when the spirit moves me. It hasn't happened for a while now, but I do. I enjoy solitude, and so I taking walks, running. I'm also very interested in research around education, especially early childhood education, which is what my career and my profession is. And I'm also interested in issues pertaining to race and equity.
Which gives us a very good segue. What has your experience been surrounding issues of race and equity, either here or in Canada, maybe even in Zimbabwe?
So my experience has been an interesting one. Since I was fortunate to move to Zimbabwe just after independence, we moved to Zim in '81. Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980. So I didn't have to go through any of the pre-independence discrimination and oppression my parents went through. And I didn't experience any of the oppression here that Black Americans were going through. When I went back to Zimbabwe, there were Black people in power leading the country. There were people who looked like me on TV. My schools were predominantly white, and so there were subtle instances of racism, like my math teacher, when the Black children would all students would sit together, and he called us the Black Hole of Calcutta, things like that. But it really didn't affect me much because, I saw myself and people around me. So we just let it slide. I went back home with an accent because I was born here, and because of that, some of my friends would say to me. I remember a white friend saying in elementary school, "Oh, Titi, I don't see you as Black. You're not like the other Blacks." And I remember thinking, what does she mean by that? I definitely didn't feel a sense of, oh, good, I'm glad she thinks that. But aside from like instances like that, I was grounded. I was comfortable. I was happy. So that being raised in Zimbabwe gave me a firm foundation of where I was from. So when I moved to Canada, many times people would be surprised at my impeccable English. Those things people say, "Oh, you speak so well. Where are you from? You speak so well." And those things which, again, it was like, "Oh, well, thank you." That's really not a compliment because what are you trying to say? But again, I was too busy worrying about the weather. It was freezing. There was a lot of snow. I was failing statistics. I was too busy worrying about all those things to really take these comments and sit with them and be affected by them. We were also, my brother also went to McGill. So when I say we, I'm talking about him too. We were also part of the African Student Society, which was a very large, very powerful, strong group. So we had that as support. And then Canada, as a country, as a whole, just feels more inviting and welcoming and a bit more inclusive than what we've experienced here in the States. So my experience there was wonderful. Then I moved here, and I moved to Boston after I graduated. And for people who know Boston or live in, Brandon actually lived in Boston and graduated. Boston has been known to be a very segregated city, and we really didn't see many Black professionals, as it were. It's very segregated. There are a lot of instances of racism there and in other places. But again, it didn't really affect me. I didn't really internalize any of those instances. So moved to Boston. I lived there for a few years before moving to New Jersey to be with Chengetai with my husband. And then the both of us moved back to Boston, where I attended Harvard University and for grad school. And that's actually where I first encountered this whole concept of white privilege. I didn't know what it meant. There were a lot of highly emotionally charged conversations with the Black people and the white people in the class. And since I didn't have the experience of being raised here, I really couldn't relate to what the Black people were saying. They were saying, we don't want apologies, we just want some understanding. There's a lot of upset, of course, on both sides. I couldn't connect to that because I hadn't lived here and had the experience of being very much discriminated against. So anyway, I graduated and we moved here to Bethesda. And I would say that only since graduating and moving and becoming a mother, is becoming a mother really was a pivotal point for me where I was like, okay, now I get it. Because the stakes are so much higher because I have my own children here and they're being raised here. Sorry, there's more. Turn the page. Okay, so as a Black person in this country, you have to constantly strive to prove that you belong in different spaces. And you have to actually be strategic about different strategies that you employ to prove that you belong. So I mentioned that I graduated from Harvard. My brother also graduated from Harvard. He from the med school. He was affiliated with the med school. And we have the Harvard sweatshirts. And some people can wake up and just decide what they're going to wear without really thinking about any intention behind it. What we joke about, and we joke, but it's not funny, is if we're going into a certain space where we feel that people won't respect us, we're like, okay, let's wear a Harvard sweatshirt, because then we belong. When Chengetai and I went to Connecticut, we had some very dear friends who lived in Connecticut, and we went to their church. It was an all-white church. People looked at us, and we could tell the questions in their eyes, like, why are these Black people here? Who are they? No one really paid us any attention until the person that we were with said, oh, she graduated from Harvard. Everyone's face lit up. Oh, that's wonderful. I went to Yale. I went to... Suddenly we fit in, we belong. There was a reason to then welcome us in. So that's one thing that we're very aware of. We have to say certain things or drop certain names in certain circumstances in certain spaces in order to belong. And that's something that Black people have to constantly do. So I mentioned my children. I have 3 children. I am a 3-year-old Anela, Noelani, just 12, and Kaya, who's waving, is 8 years old. So, like I said, like the pivotal point for me around race and equity came when I had my children. Many of you know that Noelani plays violin, and I have to actually, and Kaya just started playing violin as well. I have to honor Dominique, because what many of you may not know is that Dominique was the person who came to Chengetai and I and said, Noe should play violin. And she was very quietly supportive of Noe playing violin and of Ikaya playing violin. She was so excited. So that's why I started. But we all know that playing an instrument is important for the brain in research. But additionally, it was important for us that our children play violin, especially Ikaya, who now wants to play the guitar. It was a strategic decision because they are going to grow up and be in spaces again where they will have to be more than, and people will look at them and think, okay, make judgments or have biases based on the color of their skin. So if they play an instrument or if they do something more than that, then they'll be more readily welcomed and accepted. Especially for Ikaya, young Black boys in this country, raising them is scary. I'll call it scary. I'll call it difficult. Right now he is a cute kid. He goes up front and everyone loves him, but he is going to be seen as someone who could be threatening. And when he grows up and you see him out in the street, you might not recognize him, and you might be afraid of him. But right now, he's just cute Ikaya. So, and he's also very tall. So people will start saying, "Well, do you play basketball?" Stereotyping him, because tall black. Do you play basketball? So I said to Jane Tai, I said, he's fine. He's going to play lacrosse, and that's fantastic. But I don't want him to be stereotyped just because he's tall and he's black into basketball. I want people to see that he's able to do other things. So the decisions we make around raising our children are very strategic, possibly not for the same reasons that white people raising their children are strategic. It's so they can be seen beyond the color of their skin. And I think what is important to me or to us as parents is that people look at the children in our church because the majority of them are black. The majority of our Sunday school are black. You see them, but you see just beyond them going up and singing or being in a play, but you actually understand the reality that they are facing as black children in this country, the reality that we, their parents, are facing. It's like I said, it's scary. So we talk in the black community about having a talk, and usually talk is about the birds and the bees. In our community, the talk is not about the birds and the bees. It's about how you present yourself. It's about if you see a policeman, what you do, what you say, what you don't say, what you wear, how you act. That's the talk we have to have. And I remember when I was pregnant with my third, with Anela, and we were having these conversations, and I looked at my friends who had children Ikaya's age, and I think they were about, 3, maybe 4 or 5. And I looked at him, and I looked at their children, and I said to myself, if only they would understand how different the realities are for these boys as they grow up. And if only they would understand the burden on me as a mother compared to what they worry about for their children, because it's literally, and I'm not being dramatic, it is literally a life and death situation for us when we raise our children. So when you see your children going up in the front, please just think beyond, oh, they're doing so well and they're so cute. And think beyond that and think, okay, I wonder what they are actually going to go through as they grow up. I wonder what their parents are afraid of. When you hear stories on the news, please don't say to yourself, well, that's not me, because one day it could be one of these children that are so cute and so talented. And so that's one thing that is important to know. And then another thing is that sometimes people have the luxury of not even thinking about race. My 3-year-old goes to a wonderful, wonderful child care center. It's a Jewish, it's in a synagogue, and so it's all white, and they're very welcoming, and we love it there. And Kai went there too. She's 3, and she has begun saying she doesn't like the color of her skin. And she comes home, Mommy, I want light skin. I want long hair. And I spoke with the teachers about it, and they're trying very hard, and they read books and so on and so forth. But they said to me, well, Anela's friends just see her as Anela. They don't see her. And the conference was last week, so I have to sit down and really process what I'm going to say to them. But what I am going to explain is Anela sees herself as being brown. So that can't be ignored. You have to speak about it in class. You have to call it out, because even if her friends don't see it, even if you really don't want to talk about it, that's her reality. And she's 3. So even 3-year-olds understand difference, black 3-year-olds. They understand difference. They understand that there is some separation there. So it's never too early for us, never too early. We are starting these conversations very early about how beautiful your skin is, how beautiful your hair is, and it's it's just something we don't have the luxury of not talking about. Let's see. So then, decisions. So I said we moved to Bethesda, and and we love it here, of course. And now actually we live in Potomac, not very diverse. I think that's why we love this church so much, because it's very diverse. Um, but as Black people, we also have to be very strategic about where we go to live. I have a friend who moved to Minnesota, and she wrote me and she said, "It's wonderful here. You have to come. You have to live here." And when I sit with Chingatai and we talk, the first question we ask is, "Well, how many Black people live there? Is it diverse?" I mean, these are questions we have to ask ourselves. Will our children be accepted? I'm not comfortable moving to Minnesota because of the discrimination that happens there. It happens everywhere, but it's just an understanding of we really have to make decisions on a different level and think about things that seem so insignificant, but for us, it's a reality. Let's see. And then in terms of even places where we work, so like I said, I'm in early childhood. I've been in early childhood education for years. At one point, I was teaching at a school, and my resident, my teaching fellow, was white, and I was the lead. I was the master teacher. But everyone would come to the classroom and look for the teacher and go straight to her. It's those little things that happen. Or the place that I work at now, at a charter school, I'm the director of early childhood, and the director of student services is from Nigeria, and he's Black. And sometimes we talk about how we have to dress a certain way, present a certain way. A lot of the teachers come wearing like leggings and their hair is very relaxed, and we just can't do that because we will be seen in a different way. So there's just a lot of things that take a greater effort on our part in order to kind of belong or fit in.
Amen. Okay, last question. With all that being said, what have you had to learn or unlearn around issues of social justice?
So, you know how God works. Reverend Diggs' sermon was exactly what I had kind of put here around this question. So, of course, issues of social justice are deeply personal to me. Being a Black person, I'm seen as Black first, I'm not seen as a woman first, I'm not seen as being educated first. When I walk into the room, the first thing someone sees is my color. And so what I've learned is that there's still so much that needs to be learned and so much that needs to be done. I think sometimes we suffer from what I call the "why should we" syndrome. So if something doesn't affect us directly, then we wonder, well, why should I care? Why should I bother? If it's so we're a reconciling ministry, but if it doesn't directly affect us, we say, well, why should we actually talk about uplifting the rights of gay people? Or if I'm not Black, well, why should we talk about race? Or if I'm not disabled, well, why should we talk about putting a ramp outside a building? If I'm not a woman, well, do we really need to have conversations around gender? If I'm not poor, well, why should we talk about going and helping in issues of poverty? There's just a lot of questions. Well, why are we talking about that if it doesn't affect me directly? And I think as Reverend Dick said, it does. We're in the church, and even if it's not impacting your life in any way, I think it's important to remember that the person next to you is being impacted. Trump said something, as a very derogatory comment some weeks ago about countries that many of us are from. And there might have been the sense of, well, why should we talk about that? Why are we even having this conversation, politics and the whole thing? But again, I think it's important for us to remember that We should, because the people that we say we love, the people we say we respect, are sitting next to us in the pews on Sunday. And they are directly affected by that language, by that treatment, by those words. So we need to. So, in terms of issues of social justice, even if you may not understand my pain, you don't understand what it is if you're not a black parent, you don't understand what it is to have to speak to your 8-year-old son about how he should act with police. And um, it's not your pain to bear, but we're a family, and what we do need is that support and just that awareness and that understanding. Um, so even if it's not your reality, it definitely might be someone else's. So yes, so I've learned that issues of social justice are complicated. Talking about them is uncomfortable, but without sitting in discomfort, there can't be any change. So I am grateful that we're even having this conversation. In other spaces, other churches, it would not be happening. But it's important, again, to be a light and to remember we're lights for one another. And we can't just sit in our comfortable bubble and say, well, this doesn't affect me, so I'm just going to come to church every Sunday and I'm going to worship and I'm going to go home. We have to strive to be lights for each other and support for each other and kind of be aware of what we're going through on a deeper level. I've learned that being silent for me is no longer an option. I can't be silent because my children's lives depend on it. And like I said, without disturbing the equilibrium, there can be no change. So there's work to be done here in our church. There's work to be done outside of our church. And what I'm appreciative of those who are open and willing to learn, just not by words, but through actions.
Very powerful. Thank you, sister. Thank you. Swims, are you ready? Okay, Mr. Williams, where are you and your family from?
Well, good afternoon. First of all, I want to make just a very brief comment about having the honor of following such a strong, beautiful, bright young lady who I think has said everything that really needs to be said. I just will sit down and not say anything at all. And the fact that I am following her is an indication also that we need to continue to give consideration to the fact that not just young women, but all women have a place in our society and they need to be recognized more than what they are. Having said all of that, I'm going to deviate a little bit from the way that she has been responding because of a couple of things. One of the major things is the fact that she's a very young lady, and I'm just the opposite, an old fossil. Therefore, I'm not going to hold the mic. And the reason I'm not going to hold the mic is that after 80 years old, you begin to show some signs of age in addition to having your hair primarily white and bald. There are certain other neurological changes that take place, so I'm going to try to yell as much as possible and say whatever I want to say. No, you can just set the microphone down there. And, all right, see. I hope everyone can hear me. Oh, you can't hear me? Wow.
Quick switch.
Can anyone hear now? It's better? Okay, thank you. I was born in a small town called Aberdeen, Maryland, which is about 74 miles north of Bethesda. I am the 12th of 12 children. Two male siblings did not survive infancy, so that left 10 of us who had to struggle and fight with each other in order to get the attention and the amount of bread that we thought we should be having. My father and mother both lived in Aberdeen. I have no real knowledge of my ancestries. I'm not sure whether they came from East or West Africa or North or South. We have not obtained any information about that. My father attained a 6th grade formal education, and my mother moved to Philadelphia to live with an aunt when she was very young because her mother passed very early, but she was able to obtain a high school education. And my father was a farmer, and my mother was the homemaker. And as most women during those years, especially if you had 10 children, her primary job was to supervise the 10 children. In addition to being a farmer, my father was one of the garbage collectors in the town of Aberdeen. And I will use the term that we always said. We called him Pop, and my mother Mom. So in addition to Pop being a farmer, he was also the garbage collector for the town, as I indicated. In addition, he used to ship milk from Aberdeen to Baltimore every day, and he also sold produce at the A&P and Acme food stores in Aberdeen. Those places no one probably now even has ever heard the name, but those were the two major food stores. The house in which I was born was built by my father, and it still remains there. There are 3 sisters who are presently living there after they retired. Pop was very active, and I think one of the great characteristics that he had was that he didn't need very much sleep. 4 or 5 hours at night, and he was up and very busy. He did a lot of talking also, all the time. If he wasn't talking, he was sitting down reading, and he was really considered a very avid reader by most of us. In the farming community, the nearest other black family lived about 3 miles away. And when it was time to begin school at 6, the few little children that I played with were all white, and they said to us at that time that we can no longer play with you because we're going to a different school. Also because you are colored, and colored kids cannot go to our school. The white kids were bused, and even up through high school, they had the opportunity of having bus transportation. It was during the early years, my father and mother had to send my oldest sister to Philadelphia to live with an aunt and uncle because there was no high school for blacks in the area. My oldest brother had to catch a train and go 25 miles away from home in order to obtain a high school education. The remaining 8 of us were able to attend a black school that was established in Havre Grace. After some time and after a great deal of petitioning to the Board of Education to provide a high school for black students in Harford County. So the high school was established, but most of the parents had to pay for transportation from their home to the school. I happen to be one of the fortunate ones. I'm the last one in the family, so when I started the 3rd year of my high school, the Board of Education did provide bus transportation for me and the other black students to go to the high school. I should also mention the fact that my elementary school was about 3 miles away from home, and we had to walk there every day. After high school graduation, I attended Morgan State College in Baltimore, where I received a BS degree in chemistry and commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant in the United States Army. And upon completion of my military service in Fort Ord, California, I entered Howard University College of Medicine. While at Howard, as usual, I had to work in order to have sufficient money to go to school. So I was fortunate enough in obtaining a job in the University Health Service. And it was during that time that all freshman students were required to undergo a physical examination. I landed the job of examining urine specimens. One of the fortunate things, however, was that one day while I was examining the urine specimen, one of the nurses in the health service escorted a teacher to the area where I was, and I was introduced to this teacher. And following that introduction, I had the occasion to once in a while play a game of tennis at 6:30 in the morning. And this was followed by an occasional trip to National Airport to watch the planes take off and land. I didn't have money enough to do other things such as going to a movie or going elsewhere. But it also turned out very nicely because following these particular activities, a wedding took place, and with that young lady, and it has resulted in 4 wonderful children. Um, Upon completion of medical school, I interned at Mount Sinai Hospital in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and then I did a pediatric residency at Milwaukee Children's Hospital. It had been my intent to return home to Aberdeen to become a general practitioner. However, I was called into the chief of service office one day, and he inquired of me what my plans were after I finished my internship. And at that time, I informed him that I was going to be a general practitioner going back to Aberdeen and practice. And he began to tell me about the virtues of being a pediatrician. And he suggested that I should fill out the application that he had so that I could do a residency at that particular hospital. I filled out the application, and within that week, I received a response back that I had been accepted. So I remained at the Children's Hospital in Milwaukee and completed my residency in pediatrics. After completing my residency in pediatrics, I received a fellowship to attend Boston Children's Hospital and to pursue a subspecialty in adolescent medicine. I remained in Boston for my first job after I finished the subspecialty, and I worked at the Martha Elliott Health Center, which was a neighborhood health center in the Jamaica Plain area. And in addition, I also served as an attending physician at the Boston Children's Hospital. At the Martha Elliott Health Center, I had the privilege of working with a very distinguished and fine woman by the name of Eva Salber. Eva Salber was from South Africa, and she was my first boss who gave me a real job, and I received real money as a physician at that particular time. It was most of my advice, and I have to go back to Pop, who did a lot of talking, and there were times when I felt that he talked too much, and I wanted him to shut up at times. However, there were a number of things that I always remembered. First of all, in my practice of pediatrics, there were several things that he said to me that caused me to follow. And one was, your diet should consist of fruit and vegetables. That meat is not good for you. And though growing up on a farm, this I thought was rather unusual. Secondly, smoking is very dumb. It doesn't make sense to be blowing smoke into your body and blowing it back out again. And third, one should exercise your mind as well as your body. So when I left Boston, I had to remind my father of those words of admonition that he gave me many years ago, because it turned out that it was a number of years later that the medical community was looking at these kinds of things and accepting them. I remember when I was a student, a medical student, and attending grand rounds and conferences, it was very common to have physicians, your attending physicians, talking and smoking. And I remember one of my presentations when I had to talk about a condition referring to as Tokyo Yokohama asthma. The attending physician took issue with some of what I had to say, and he reminded me that I was still a resident and that I didn't have the privilege of talking about attending physicians in the manner in which I did because smoking was only personal pollution. While I was in Boston, we served also as host parents. There was a fellow from Ghana and one from Nigeria. Both of these fellows were in school at MIT. And I had the opportunity of taking care of a young girl who was a patient in the hospital from Tanzania. And it was these three individuals who increased my interest in doing some voluntary work in one of the African countries. So when I came to Washington to attend the pediatric meeting, I decided to go to these three embassies, but I found the Tanzanian embassy first. I went in and talked with the people at the Tanzanian embassy, and I made the decision at that time that I was going to Tanzania. The people were just so nice that the following year, my wife and 4 children, we were off to Tanzania. The youngest of our children was 4 years old at that particular time. My initial experience in Tanzania was not favorable at all. Seeing 2 and 3 children dying every day from preventable diseases. And these diseases included malnutrition, measles, and malaria, which were the big 3, and then diarrheal diseases. And it was more than what I had bargained for, I felt. And I was ready to come back home, but I didn't have financial resources to bring my folks back home, so I decided the only thing to do was to straighten up and go back and continue to do my work and remain there until my contract was over. But during that time, I began to recognize some things, and I had to go back to Pop and the farming experience. Some of what he said also during the early hours, and I have to mention this also, during the spring of the year, April and May, I had the, I don't know whether to say fortune or misfortune, of having to get up about 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the morning. And I had to go out and begin doing some of the farming. And many individuals here now wouldn't know what that was. But I had to go and do some of the plowing and preparing the soil before I went to school in the morning. But in remembering what he had to say, he said that about food and nutrition. And I was convinced in Tanzania that good in order for one to have good health, you have to have good nutrition. And good nutrition requires good agriculture, and education is a change agent for sustainability. So after my contract was over, we recognized these things and we returned back to the U.S. and made the decision that we would form a nonprofit organization ahead and continue our work. So for the past 32 years, we've had the honor of working with volunteers and community members in Tanzania and the Gambia, helping people help themselves, improve their lives and the lives of others in their community. My family or my faith journey, I was born in the Methodist Church. It was the Methodist Episcopal Church. That's what it was called before the unification. My father was served as superintendent of the church school for 35 years, which meant that we had no time to stay at home to play or to do other things. We had to go to church every Sunday. In addition to he being the church school superintendent, during World War II, one of the things was that in the U.S., gasoline was very scarce for people, but he took it upon himself to use his vehicle as the means of transportation for bringing children to and from his church school. And he was a very active church member for a number of years. My father died, he was a little over 100, short of 101, of prostate cancer. My mother died very much earlier. She was only 65. Also, while at Morgan State, which was started by the Methodist Church, I had two roommates. One was a devout Catholic, and the other did not profess any religious affiliation at that particular time. Anthony, who was the Catholic member of our room, constantly reminded us almost every day that the Catholic Church was the only true church. While in the military, I decided to test this out because maybe my father and others around the community just had it a little bit wrong. So I explored the Catholic Church, the Episcopalian Church, and later, after marrying, the Unitarian and the Baptist Church. And it was the fact that I decided, or maybe because I was brought up in the Methodist Church, I did revert back to the United Methodist Church, particularly after coming to North Bethesda and meeting so many outstanding and wonderful people. One of the other things that my father would always say as we were growing up, know for yourself. Do not accept what someone else tells you, but you must read and know what is right. My hobbies have included watching little children grow, tennis, traveling, and more recently, a cousin of mine has convinced me that I really need to go back and do a lot of reading of history. I hated history when I was in school. My talents and special skills? None. Experience around race and equity. As I indicated, from early childhood, I've been confronted with the issue of race relations. But my parents taught us early to respect everyone according to how they respect you. We were taught that we were just as good as anyone else. We must learn as much as we can. Keep on studying and reading, for reading makes you a ready man. My oldest brother, Percy, even though he was not able to attend a high school in Harford County, where he had to travel 25 miles to attend high school. But he became assistant superintendent of schools in the state of Maryland, and upon his retirement, he became the president of the Harford County Board of Education and had to constantly encounter indignities and continue to be on the superintendent's back about equal opportunities for education of children. What have I had to learn or unlearn around issues of social justice? I was brought up learning that every person is important in life. Issues such as economic injustice, slavery, racism, capital punishment, gender inequalities have no place in human connectivity. That all women and men are made in the image of God and have an equal value. Thus, I am at odds with some present practices of the United Methodist Church. The church is broad enough and forward-thinking enough to allow me to do that. Outstandingly, Bishop Easterling, in her message to the church just last month, reconfirmed that all women and men are made in the image of God, and all persons are equally valuable in the sight of God. We must work towards a world in which each person's value is respected and nurtured. I would mention the fact also that my parents saw to it that all 10 of us went beyond high school, and many of us have we have different degrees and so forth. Since being on a wonderful journey, I want to just mention one or two awards and recognitions that I have been fortunate enough to receive. I received the Distinguished Community Service Award from Morgan State University, Humanitarian Award from Morgan State University, Outstanding Service Award from the Consortium of African American public health schools, and the Howard University Medical Alumni Award. And finally, after having to attend the segregated high school in Havre de Grace, the Havre de Grace High School inaugurated a Hall of Fame award, and I, along with 5 other members of the inaugural class of 2010, including the late U.S. Senator Millard Tydings, who was also one of the inaugural awardees. So that's all the noise that I have made. I did ask my wife to be nice to me and pass around some pictures that many people perhaps would not really recognize, but it shows a little bit about my growing up. While Brandon is doing this, I should make one comment, and that is that I have my oldest daughter who came to protect me from everyone here, and one of my grandsons, Kari, is here also in the audience.
Awards when we were in Boston, Massachusetts, the health center that he worked out of, they named the health center after him. The other thing, he won the United Nations Award for his work in East
Thank you, Dr. Williams. I was actually going to pass it around to see if anyone had any questions for Dr. Williams or Cece. So, anyone?
I know I spoke this morning already.
I've preached in many churches, and I'm not known to be one who will flatter anybody. But just being here this morning, it's the fullness of the grace of God. And almost perfection of what God's kingdom is supposed to be. You all have something wonderful. And I'm just glad I was able to be a part of it. And the realization, that this right here, it is so powerful and so overwhelming that so many churches and community of God need to be doing this. I know you talked about the sermon this morning, but you have given me something that I carry the rest of my life. And I've preached in churches with over 1,000 members. This small group here, you have so much power. And the world has yet to see what God can do with a group of people who are fully gospel that includes all of God's children. I better stop before I raise a love offering.
Thank you, everyone. And this concludes our session for today.